Cool.
So my name is Lester Spence. I'm a professor of political science and Africana studies at Johns Hopkins University. I study Black politics, racial politics, and urban politics. I've been particularly interested in the political production of inequality in the wake of the neoliberal turn. I co-wrote the Baltimore School manifesto, and several years ago as a way to articulate a set of ethical values and principles in the wake of kind of activism around Freddie Gray's death, but the beginnings of it, thinking about political work in Baltimore go at least back to Occupy Baltimore, if not before that. I thought that we were in a moment where, for the first time, it was basically possible to be an academic or an intellectual and be connected in one way to a social movement or a political movement, and then use that to accrue private resources for themselves in the name of this movement in the academy. In this way, really quickly, it's Adolph Reed wrote about this dynamic in the early 90s when we see the rise of the quote unquote Black public intellectual. And he talked about how individuals like Cornel West were running basically kind of a Proudhon scam. Proudhon was a French anarchist who according to Reed's view, Reed's a Marxist, basically was able to articulate himself as an intellectual in certain spaces and as a political movement person in other spaces. And then that dynamic would enable him to basically dodge responsibility in both spaces. So if he was an activist, he couldn't be judged as an intellectual. If he's an intellectual, he couldn't be judged as an activist.
And hi, everyone. My name is Ailish Hopper, and I teach in the Peace Studies and Integrated Art Studies programs at Goucher College. I'm a poet and multidisciplinary artist, and my work focuses on co-design, collaborations across asymmetries of power, particularly along racial lines. And I draw pretty deeply from transformative and transitional justice spaces. And I co-wrote the manifesto with Lester because I'd really been sitting with the dilemma, which is not only a theoretical dilemma of how to address dynamics that I myself or groups that I'm involved in are also co-producing. So how do you shift something you're in the middle of, and we're all producing it together. And I wanted to, along with Lester and a lot of other folks that we've been thinking with and working with, contribute to a document that might be part of contributing to expanding political imagination. And the manifesto form kind of operates both in the way that traditional scholarship does, describing what is and has been, but also in the register of what we might think of as like creative writing or creative acts, which is also describing what could be. And I think, Lester, you've used that phrase, kind of addressing the fundamental dynamics. We wanted to write a document that would get at what we feel are the fundamental dynamics that keep producing similar outcomes, even if we're using the language or the scripts and characters of change. And really one way to think of it is we wanted to intervene on the interventions. just seen a lot of, you name it, really, from groups and actors and ideologies with, in some cases, really, really great politics or politics that I share, but the actual interventions and the actual situations, we're missing some key factors. So we just really wanted to try and describe that.
Yeah, and one thing as I thought about this, it is an intervention on interventions, but it's also actually an intervention on the self. So one of the things that I can say is that writing that document has actually helped to structure how I actually move in the world after the document was created. So it wasn't just that we co-wrote the document and then we put it out in the world, but we existed separate and distinct from it. And it's like that document, I consistently go back to that document and think about it as a way to govern and structure my own behavior. So in fact, as I think about it, it's moved in the world, but I think it's probably had more of an effect on me than I think it has, than it's affected anything else.
Well, that kind of gets at something that, a word that we used, which is an ethic. And I think that's also something that Nicole was thinking about. I mean, it's the subject of this panel, right? Is kind of what are the ethics? And we use that word a lot in the plural because we're thinking about, schematics, or we're thinking about maybe like boundaries, like don't go over here because that's unethical. Stay around here. But we were thinking about it more like what's an approach, right? Because when you were first using that phrase, the Baltimore School, the other reason we really wanted to write about it in the manifesto was we're not talking about a group, we're talking about an approach. So there's not an insider outsider dynamic. It's not about a collective, even although there are a number of wonderful collectives that are involved in the approach. But an ethic is something different. Like you said, it's something that it's like a plant that it's a commitment. It's a plant that we maybe plant, but we have to keep watering it. So we come back to it and it's growing and changing, or the practice is growing and changing all the time. And I guess that also brings us to translucency. So the name or the metaphor maybe that we were using to try and get at, I mean, as we talk through, okay, what are the situations that we can think of where we really feel like there is a boundary and it gets crossed into not the ethic, let's say. And as we talked more and more about these situations that, we're surrounded by, most of us are, because they're often what success looks like, not just personal, like career success, but like what success looks like in changing things in communities. We kept coming back to this issue of like drawing attention to one's work, or this thing of taking credit. And so I don't even remember how translucency as a metaphor, I remember Jessica Schiller mentioned it. And I said, wow, that really seems to describe this thing we're seeing from so many organizers and from folks that we run with and respect, who are saying, that too is on the table as a resource, and an unquestioned one too, that then kind of has a multiplier effect. So it should be questioned maybe in some different ways.
Yeah. So one of the so one of the things that becomes prominent in the wake of the neoliberal turn is the concept of human capital, where we all become basically capitalists of our own labor. So human capital, we work on our own human capital and develop it, and then we're able to get the fruits of our own labor. It's a real messed up idea, but it's had really, really important consequences for the world. It's become important in understanding why some countries are better than others, or have more are more productive than others. It's been used to understand why some populations and then individuals are more quote unquote productive than others. But part of that dynamic of getting of kind of getting control of your own is human capital is beginning to think of yourself as a firm, and then thinking of your outputs as kind of as a firm, or it's like intellectual property. So with academics, our cachet is basically citation, right? We trade in citations. And if you take that idea, that citation idea, it doesn't take a lot. And then we talk about the role race and gender play and how resources are distributed within the academy. It doesn't take a lot to articulate a condition whereby citation becomes something that discriminated minorities can use to develop themselves. And then, in as much as their work is in this moment by nature determined to be political, like to be an academic talking about racial politics is itself political, we can imagine a dynamic where kind of citing one's work in the field becomes kind of a certain type of political act that, rather than being about human capital, ends up becoming about becomes kind of a progressive act. And that's kind of a long, contorted way to talk about it. But the one thing that we thought that we shouldn't be about was that. You know, the one thing we thought that we should not be about was about going into the world, trying to make intellectual interventions, and then somehow using those interventions and claiming those interventions. Actually, we thought that the opposite approach would work. That is, to the extent we are about making interventions, we would make those interventions where people didn't really know it was us.
Right. And but once you take an intervention and you say, okay, anything but that, then you have to ask the question, well, then what isn't that? You know, what if we say that this is creates a social economy, and I understand that people prefer not to use like the economic metaphor to, you know, like, how's that helping? But then what does a different social economy look like? And we see the rise, you know, particularly in the last 2 years of, well, much longer than that, but we're hearing about it in pop culture around mutual aid. But at scale, what does it look like? Like, what is it, you know, when we're imagining? And of course, you know, the abolitionist imaginary has a whole society, you know, imagined that looks like relationships at all kinds of scales, institutions, you know, civic societies set up on a wholly different set of relationships. So we wanted to just kind of play that out, in particular in the spaces that we're exposed to, right? The scholar entrepreneur, the artist entrepreneur, the social entrepreneur, these things that in a certain kind of space, I was going to say career space, but they become career space. Everything becomes a career space, and precisely ones that should not be, or that really become activated in a way that undermines whatever we might earnestly be trying to do. And, you know, I was thinking also about how one of our early definitions of what the Baltimore School approach would look like would be that it's always seeing the political economy. Like, nothing is existing in a vacuum. Of course, it's, you know, it's coupled with all these larger dynamics. But then that also really led us to understand the ways that ideas, so human capital, but also ideas, which are actually really quite precious, and particularly for scholars and folks who, right, it's not, ideas are not just a thing that you're trying to get cited more. We actually need ideas. We really need ideas. And as we played out like the thought experiment, we were even kind of saying like, wow, the way that the neoliberal university, you know, and then all of the other spaces where the, you know, quote, next big idea, what's fundable, et cetera, is what drives social change. It emaciates, it brings any kind of idea functionality in line with what neoliberalism. So that was another thing we wanted to kind of free up in that imaginary.
Yeah, there have been a question. There are questions in the academy about how the neoliberal term comes to be. And a guy who used to be at Hopkins, but he left, Scottish American guy, Mark Blythe. Uh, his book, Great Transformations, builds on the work of Polanyi, and he argues that ideas have particular valence in moments of crisis. And it's really that idea that I've been basically working on. That is, in moments of crisis, you can't turn to interests because what you want isn't really clear. You can't turn to institutions because they're unstable and they don't necessarily structure action. And arguably, you can't even turn to identity necessarily. So in this case, you kind of need ideas. It's in this moment that ideas become independently important, because otherwise, in other moments, ideas are going to be secondary to interest. So what you want determines, how you ideationally respond, or what institution you're situated in naturally generates the ideas. But it's in moments of crisis, and if there's anything that's true, it's like we're in a crisis. We've been in like a damn years long crisis. It's in moments like these that ideas work. So it's moments like these that folks who work in ideas, who trade in ideas, who live off of ideas, who develop ideas, can have the most purchase. So it's really, so if we think about it's not just thinking about, when we think about political economy, thinking about in that moment where we realize, where for the first time we all realize that state violence has a particular impact on certain communities. Ideationally understanding that dynamic is a byproduct of political economy gets us into a whole different set of solution sets than if we think that state violence is constitutively anti-Black in kind of a cultural sense, or even a quasi-genetic sense. Like, yes, separate and distinct from the political economy.
Yeah, and I think in Baltimore in the last, I don't know, I mean, we are in sort of a constant, maybe an ebb and flow of crises, but in particular from a movement perspective or an organizing perspective in Baltimore, thinking about Occupy and thinking about around the time of the uprising, I just to say personally, seeing the ways that very distinct social spaces or groups that were really organizing for a particular topic or interest, right, or advocacy issue, the spaces became really porous, and there was all this capacity built. There was so much capacity, but were the ideas there? And that, so this thing about like the things were sort of like ready to go, but was the next right idea there? And I don't want to get too far down into the organizing question of that particular situation, but that kind of brings us to, the role of ideas also brings us to, I think, translucency, where I think some of the feedback we got from folks that first read the manifesto was, oh, so translucency is basically refusal. It's just saying, okay, everything should be anonymous, just refuse to take all credit. And I think in some of the projects that we've done, we noticed, well, actually, we really experiment. And the folks who've eldered us or who we work with, there's actually a wide spectrum. So translucency isn't as simple as just being undercover or underground, but it's also noticing the ways that, for instance, as a professor in a university, I can get promoted for the things that I am willing to put on my CV, the things that I make above ground, the things that I, put on social media or all that kind of stuff. But we all know that there's underground stuff happening all the time. Like, how many meetings are you having, relationships developing, all the things that take years and years and years? And why are we gonna, so we end up with this hierarchy where sort of like fake mutual aid is rewarded, and like sort of the real work that we're doing is not rewarded. And that's also real knowledge building. There's really important stuff happening there. So translucency is really more of a set of practices of solidarity, a spectrum, right? And a skill. And like all skills, it's like knowing when we should be public about something and when we shouldn't, when we take credit, when we share credit, when we, you know, that we understand that we know when to turn to the market or the tools of the market, when we should be on social media or seeking funding from a foundation or, you know, working with our universities or whatever else. And when that's not, we're facing our communities, we're facing one another. But to know how to do those kinds of things, it requires, yeah, a different kind of imagination. Or discernment or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's worth saying. So the other aspect is that the ethic we're talking about political economy. Embedded in that is idea that that is at least alter capitalist, if but at most is anti-capitalist. That is so we're so when I think about what's not that, you know, it's not about what individuals, although there are individuals who aren't that, you know, who aren't aligned with the principles that we lay out in the manifesto. It's also, you know, what set of actions and in general, although again, you know, we live in the world, we have to deal with this. In general, it's alter capitalist. It's again, at least alter capitalist, if not explicitly anti-capitalist.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to hearing from other folks on the panel, and I don't know if there's much else we want to get.
I think this is dope.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right.